Glendinning is a professor of architectural conservation here at Edinburgh University. By discipline, he is what you would call an expatriate classicist. He has published a number of books on the modern built environment, most recently as New History of Preservation and Conservation, for which there are flyers in the exhibition. He's currently researching the history of public housing in Hong Kong and Singapore. Today he's going to be drawing on research from a previous book, Modern Movement, which focused on the life and work of the Scottish modern architect, Robert Matthew. Miles Glendinning.
Right, thanks very much. We're now in the second age of modern architecture, and in the exhibition and the contributions by the practitioners today, we're looking at the various ways that this modernity can engage with the built environment of world heritage. So I thought it might be interesting in this method session to do the same for comparison with a corresponding figure from the first age of modernist architecture, which in Scotland is the 3 decades, 1945 to 75, and I'll be using as a case study the foremost 20th century Scottish modern architect, Robert Matthew. Before we get on to Matthew, I'd like to sketch out a few general themes, in particular to try to suggest some of the more significant differences between then and now in the modernity and heritage relationship. Now, to start off with, but now both conservation and modern architecture are kind of international, global discourses today. That didn't apply to the same extent in the 50s and 60s, although the close relationship of conservation and extreme nationalism had ended by then, and despite initiatives like the founding of ICOMOS and the Venice Charter, etc., on the whole, there was no world heritage movement as such. Heritage was still mainly seen as a national or even a local matter, in contrast to the assumed global scope of the modern movement at that stage, whose architects saw themselves as being, by definition, highly international. Because far fewer buildings were considered old, and most late 19th and early 20th century architecture was still considered as being in very bad taste, heritage was still seen in terms of islands or fragments in the onrush of modernity, whereas today, in Europe at least, with today's ever more sweepingly kind of grandiose and all-encompassing ideas of cultural landscape or intangible heritage, blah blah, the reverse is arguably true. In fact, the word intervention, that's so commonly used today to denote a kind of new enclave of modernity in a historic setting, didn't even really exist then, except significantly in Italy. Of course, actually, if you go back one, yeah. By the 50s and 60s, the concept of urban heritage had expanded out to a rather wider scale than the old monument. The heritage ideal of the historic Old Town core, or the Altstadt, had already been prominent since the 1890s. Edinburgh was one of many cities with an increasingly strong heritage culture, led in Britain by private societies like the Cockburn Association here in Edinburgh, who sort of agitated against demolitions or also against visual intrusion from like large buildings or large adverts. The growing sense of the preciousness of the old town here in Edinburgh was also kind of fermented from the 90s in the propagandizing by Geddes. But the entire debate, arguably, was on a rather smaller scale. Each city was kind of its own microcosm. The global capitalist tourism cum commercial marketing, the implicit potential homogenization that's so prominent in the World Heritage System was almost entirely absent. And partly because there was so much less heritage then, and no sort of like heritage mafia as such, contemporary architects almost never, unlike today, saw heritage as a threat or kind of attacked heritage people or organizations as oppressors or whatever. And correspondingly, a lot more urban fabric, especially the everyday 19th century fabric, was seen as kind of, open for demolition. But that modernism in the high welfare state era was also a bit different from today itself. A bit different from today's modern contemporary architecture. It was a bit less commercialized in the building types that it foregrounded. It was less insistently individualist or iconic. It was a bit more anonymous sometimes in its self-expression. So its preferred relationship to the islands of heritage was slightly different. For one thing, despite its egalitarian rhetoric, post-war modernist ideas still had some pretty elitist ideas. In Britain, at any rate, Noel Annan's book, Our Age, vividly shows how post-war Fabian social democracy was firmly rooted in the 19th century culture of the liberal-minded gentleman. One thing really totally absent from the post-war modernism-heritage relationship was today's idea of a common alliance between contemporary architecture and heritage in pursuit of an agenda of commercial marketing. Where there was a close alliance was between architects' modernist idea of honesty and the contemporary conservation concept of honesty and authenticity as represented, for example, in the 1964 Venice Charter, the idea that the old and the new should be clearly and legible and distinguishable from each other. Both sides, both the modern architects and the heritage people, passionately agreed in condemning anything that was kind of smacking of a mixture of the two as pastiche, as you can see, for example, on the left-hand side in the kind of student polemic against the building of a classical style exam building just down the street from here in Edinburgh. People like the architect, the conservationist Raymond Lemaire embodied this idea of legibility in their own practice. And there's at the bottom centre is a chapel by Lemaire. The appropriate style of new architecture next to the old was seen as a rather restrained background modernity, and that's very much in contrast to the often rather frenetically busy designs of today's interventions. And then in the years before the triumph of the Jane Jacobs ideals of mixed-use agglomeration and urban realm postmodernist planning and the rejection of zoning-based modernist segregated planning, it was still seen as legitimate to try to insert or enlarge large single-use complexes demarcated from the traditional street, in inverted commas, and for non-capitalist purposes in the historic core. But this idea of a kind of complementary modernity wasn't static, it evolved over time, most notably in the 60s and the early 70s in reaction to the growing crisis of confidence within modernism and the growing confidence of heritage. Its style evolved over time from the simple rectilinearity of the Siam modernism to the more complex agglomerated forms of the 60s and early 70s, so hence the multiple modernities of the title. Right, let's now look specifically at Robert Matthew and his work in the heritage settings of his hometown, because Matthew's family background was steeped in Edinburgh's arts and crafts traditionalism. His father was a partner of Robert Lorimer, but as a newly graduated architect here at ECA, he himself turned to modernism and to the new mid-20th century world of public authority architectural practice. He spent 7 years as the chief architect planner of the London County Council, 46 to 53, and he then founded a large firm dedicated to welfare state building projects, Robert Matthew Johnson Marshall, the became RMJM and later not lamented in its most recent form. Now, although Matthew mainly moved away from architectural design by the 60s, and as his personal enthusiasm became increasingly focused on international architectural diplomacy, he continued, though, to keep a close eye on any projects by his own firm in historic Edinburgh, and hence what I'm focusing on today. And his semi-detached attitude to architectural design allowed him to kind of ride out and even exploit the crisis of modern architecture from 1968, and to kind of shift in his final years from 1960, final 6 years of life, 69 to 75, towards a combination of global environmentalism abroad and conservation at home, where he played the lead role in the efforts to save the new town, led up to the setting in the early 70s of the Newtown Conservation Committee, the ancestor of the EWH. Now, that final episode gives our story, a bit of a sting in the tail and takes it rather outside the realm of the typical modern architect, and I'll return to that at the end of the talk. But first of all, I want to do just very straightforward thing, just look at a chronological selection of new projects in inner Edinburgh in his private practice days. All of these were projects where Matthew himself took the lead role in the design concept, and which illustrate a gradual shift from a more massive rectilinear sort of early Siams of imposing stuff solutions towards lower scale, more heritage sensitive approaches. And it's important to stress some of these projects were built, but some of them were only partly built or not even built at all. Right, well, let's first of all look at a succession of projects he did for the redevelopment of Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary, just south of here, over a 20-year period, 1955 to 75. A huge in-situ redevelopment project that eventually virtually came to nothing, frustrated by the impossibilities of stage rebuilding on the existing site. Now, what we see here is a shift in Matthew's approach from a kind of massive Big Bang proposal in the 50s, using a huge T-shaped 17-storey tower to decant accommodation from the rest of the site and kind of kickstart rebuilding, and rather perversely the tower was going to be built at the top of the site, to a denser and rather more modestly scaled network of medium-rise courtyard plan blocks, gradually sort of transforming the site through decanting from northwest to southeast, but still in a rather plain international modern style with long window bands. Now, the tower proposal, or the tower slab proposal, was defeated essentially by an earlier and more local equivalent of the World Heritage Site furores over towers and skylines, and effectively orchestrated in this local instance by the local official watchdog, the late lamented Royal Fine Art Commission for Scotland. And I think it's difficult to judge whether Matthew actually saw this massive block at the top left as a serious proposal, because he himself was a member of the Royal Fine Art Commission, or if he actually anticipated it would be turned down, subsequently generating further design work. Maybe that's a rather sort of cynical interpretation. But the low-height courtyard proposal, on the other hand, was defeated by its own complexity and slowness. Although when it was first put forward in the early 60s, the city's main heritage zone, what was then seen as heritage zone, was kind of out of sight of a medium-rise building. By the time the only block actually built was commenced in 1975, the early 19th century tenements around it, and then the 19th century hospital itself, were also kind of seen as heritage. So eventually the redevelopment was abandoned, the hospital was kind of plonked in the city outskirts. So today, the rather enigmatically named Phase 1, which is the bottom right there, is left standing as a rather Ozymandias on its own opposite ECA. Right, let's now look at another similar development in the same general area, just south of the old town, but did get built, partly. And this was a redevelopment of part of George Square, informal classical mid-18th century forerunner of the new town, redevelopment by the university, which was determined, like the hospital, to stay in the inner city. It had procured a succession of plans in the 40s and the 50s setting out just that, and most recently this 1955 plan by Basil Spence envisaging a sort of flowing landscape of courtyards and towers. Matthew was brought in from 1958. He and Spence tended to sort of like work in parallel with each other and all these things, to design an initial phase of arts accommodation at one corner of the square. And he produced a succession of sketch proposals for a tower flanked by lower blocks, breaking open the southeast corner of the square with open podia, and then with horizontally banded international modern fenestration, combined with a sort of localizing image element of stone cladding panels and timber window frames. And this provoked the city's first major conservation protest battle. Matthew argued George Square was a local and second-rate piece of heritage, which had already been compromised by demolitions and which was intrinsically inferior in its irregular vernacular classicism. His opponents, a group of voluntary enthusiasts and forerunners of the Architectural Heritage Society today, followed the increasingly familiar heritage line that the mere fact of threat conferred heritage value and should be opposed on principle. And in this case, they were unsuccessful, and Matthew's scheme, which was finished in 1963, was itself a few years ago listed at Category A as part of a grouping with buildings by other Scottish modernists. Right, next, third case, slightly later still, is the Midlothian County Buildings Extension of 1964. Now, I think this is a especially interesting case. It's a local authority headquarters building in the heart of the old town. where Matthew displaced in inverted commas pastiche scheme with a sort of contextual modern scheme of his own. The large site fronting the entire street block on the west side of George IV Bridge between the Lawn Market and Victoria Street had long been earmarked for an annex to the classical county building opposite, which was kind of like a county council hinterland of Edinburgh, Midlothian. Occupying the site on the left-hand picture was a 19th century block in a so-called Flemish historicist style. This was the first 1840s attempt to build contextually in the new town, as in the first of the phase of all the many improvement interventions and driving through a street. Now, the first of the post-war modernist redevelopment schemes for this site in 1960 was by traditionalist architectural firm Reed and Forbes, and it tried to respond to this rather sort of Janus-like site with a similar stylistic response, a classical style east facade, rather kind of like a bank, facing the classical buildings across George IV Bridge. You can see up at the top right the what it was facing, and then a kind of baronial style, shorter north and south ends to reflect the old town burgage plot layout. Now, this project was dropped following protest by the Fine Art Commission at its sort of old-fashioned, supposedly pastiche character, and then mysteriously Matthew, who was a commission member, as I said, emerged as architect for the site instead. And he'd argued that the previous proposal was, quote, a ludicrous juxtaposition of two extreme, entirely different architectural expressions in the same building, unquote. And what was needed was, quote, a true 20th century solution. But his solution actually also tried to echo the site's two faces, but in a more oblique and, arguably a little bit more sophisticated way. The main facade was treated as a composition of horizontal banding of windows and stone cladding, offset dynamically by a tall rubble pier, asymmetrical. The north and south ends, though, were broken up into verticalized units. These are some of his initial sketch designs. They were broken up into verticalized units that were staggered back on a podium at the south end. A design which I think effectively combined a degree of formal monumentality on one side with a contextual intricacy on the other. Now, this single-use public authority administrative complex was demolished in 2007, and it was replaced by a mixed-use commercial development of banks, jazzy hotels and restaurants, etc., designed by architect Alan Murray in a subtly different style with rather individualized contextual detailing distributed rather evenly over the whole building without any kind of differentiated elements. An approach somehow more easily compatible with today's tourist marketing agenda of World Heritage Sites, but somehow more anonymous and maybe a bit less individual. Now, the final project I want to look at briefly, before we just go on at the end to the Newtown conservation issue, is another unrealised one, and this is the so-called Castle Terrace Theatre development, which is a protracted saga from the early 70s to the early 80s that ultimately fell victim to the shift in opinion and affordability against mega redevelopment projects. The long-standing perception in Edinburgh of a lack of a large theatre suitable for opera-scale performances, and Matthew's firm was brought in by the City Council to design a project on a very visually sensitive site directly confronting the southwest side of the castle. Following the kind of internal logic of theatre planning requirements, Matthew came up with a solution that was diagonally planned right across the site from a massively articulated corner entrance and then dominated at the other end by a tall fly tower. So, absolutely guaranteeing the same skyline intrusion recipe that had previously doomed the Royal Infirmary, the first proposal for the infirmary. When this predictably was turned down as too intrusive, after Matthew's death in 1975, a scaled-down, mildly sort of po-mo classical version was produced by RMJM colleagues, again, though without a built outcome. And with this project, I think we're dealing with not first-generation modernism, but we've kind of got to the point of the uneasy transition to postmodern classicism, which was something which in Edinburgh always had to exist in the shadow of the suddenly gargantuan and all-encompassing conservation movement. Which brings us on to Matthew and saving the Newtown. Now, what was a bit unusual, in the case of Matthew was the fact that really almost uniquely among the front-rank modernist architects of his generation, well certainly in Scotland, but even in Britain, he actively shifted to embrace the cause of conservation after 1968, especially at home in Scotland. The 1960s for him were a kind of twin-track thing. Global environmentalist campaigning abroad in pursuit of the UN habitat cause in alliance with Doxiadis, the acoustics movement, etc., etc. And then at home in Scotland, heritage proselytizing. What was rather squeezed out between the two was the large, aggressive new projects of modern architecture. But Matthew did remain true to many key values of our age in the Nolan sense, notably the social democrat horror of anything smacking of free market laissez-faire and accompanied by the kind of, the assumption of the droit de seigneur, the liberal cultured gentleman, and there he is at the top there. So in turning to conservation, he wasn't embracing the kind of all-inclusive, anything threatened must be saved ethos that we know only too well today, and I'm not sure what he would have made of the Colton Gate campaign, for example. His aim was to identify the most important, or what he saw as the most important examples, and to go all out for the comprehensive preservation of those, even at the expense of the lesser ones. In a rather as a kind of harbinger of the universal claims of the World Heritage System, he saw significance not in British or European but global terms, but all of course within the elite Western cultural framework of the day. And in pursuing that agenda, he identified one piece of Scottish architectural heritage as preeminent against or over all the others, the Edinburgh New Town, as a largely, a uniquely large-scale international pioneer of neoclassical town planning. Others he saw as being, high significance to Scottish or British people, like for example, Edinburgh Castle or other Scottish castles, or the old Edinburgh Old Town or Stirling Old Town. Others he saw as internationally significant, but at a more esoteric level, like Glasgow School of Art or Abbotsford or New Lanark. But and other things again, like George Square, you would say, no, this is of local significance or second-rate quality. Only the New Town that Matthew saw as being on a different plane, both in art historical terms and as a pioneer in the kind of coordinated urban development that he himself had advocated for the 20th century. Okay, it was still an elite residential area, but subject to fraying at the edges, an insidious threat of decay or degradation that could easily be put right, but needed coordinated attention and money from various government institutions to do this. And that was precisely what he set about doing, organising a massive condition survey of the new town, including loads of sort of photos and documentation, getting a range of pressure groups and government agencies together at an international conference in June 1970 at the Assembly Rooms, and then following this up with brokering the central and local government funding for the permanent grant repair organisation, the Edinburgh New Town Conservation Committee, which was founded in 1971. And so successful was the ENTCC that by the time it was merged with the Old Town Trust to form the EWH, the New Town's problems of slum decay at the edges and the general disrepair had been basically solved. The saving, in inverted commas, of the New Town, he saw in some ways as a modern planning challenge in old dress, an extension of the urban coordination agenda of modernist planning, but using old fabric rather than new construction. As his colleague John Richards recalled, quote, Robert liked big ideas and he saw the new town as a big idea, worth preserving as much for its grand consistency as for the specifics of its architecture, unquote. Now in the process, you could say that the sharp old-new distinction demanded by modernism was eroded. If this was a modernist planning exercise, but using old substance. But this happened without any recourse to the so-called pastiche that the modernists and conservationists both detested, and at the same time kind of keeping at bay the beginnings of Jane Jacobs-esque, POMO, mixed-use, urban realm stuff. Right, okay, so in conclusion, I talked earlier on, a little bit earlier on, about the way that the first modern movement's ideal of a complementary modernity was not static, but evolved over time, especially in the 60s and 70s, away from simple Siam type block planning towards greater complexity in reaction to the growing crises of confidence within modernist urban redevelopment and the growing confidence of heritage at that stage. Now, clearly the same circumstances are unlikely to repeat themselves, but I think it'll be interesting to see how today's orthodoxies of intense, highly individual, rather commodified mixed-use interventions will survive the wider economic crisis in Europe and the architectural crisis of iconic neo-modernism. Thank you.